Thank you. Thank you a great, great deal. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Martin. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great, great pleasure to be here on this occasion. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Dr. Martin for that kind introduction. And I'd be remiss if I didn't begin by thanking my wife, Pam Horowitz, who really is the reason I'm standing here tonight. She is the air I breathe, Don't let me go on. Don't let me go on. I'm just so happy that she's with me. And I want to introduce the members of my family who are seated in the first couple. Stand up, people. You know who you are. These are sister, brother, children, grandchildren, and we're happy to see them. Be seated, please. Now, the theme of President Obama's opening inaugural event, the concert at the Lincoln Memorial, was "We Are One." When he recently gave the commencement address at the U.S. Naval Academy, he spoke of a fundamental truth, that out of many, we are one. So the NAACP has come back to the city of its birth to say, we are one, we are 100. To members of the Board of Directors and the Special Contribution Fund, to Vice Chair Brock, to our hostess, Hazel Dukes, to members of the Special Contribution Fund, members of the NAACP and friends, welcome to the NAACP Centennial Convention. Now, as you know, or perhaps as you hope to know, when you get to be 100, you're allowed to celebrate yourself. So let's hear it. Let's give ourselves a real big celebration. Here. It was 100 years ago, during the first week of 1909, that three people met right here in New York City to form what would become the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. One of them was the descendant of abolitionists, the second was Jewish, the third was a Southerner whose mother's people were Kentucky slaveholders, as my father's people were Kentucky slaves. The immediate spark for the founding of the NAACP was the Springfield riot of 1908, when African Americans were lynched within a half mile of the only home Abraham Lincoln ever owned and within 2 miles of his grave. When we were founded in 1909, President Theodore Roosevelt was ending his second term. He shared traits with many of today's Negrophobes. He liked individual African Americans, but he believed the mass was less than human. His successor, William Howard Taft, said his little brown brothers, that's us, would need 50 to 100 years to become equal with whites. NAACP Executive Walter White said of the next president, Herbert Hoover, he did nothing to indicate he regarded Negroes as citizens and human beings. No president would speak to an NAACP audience until Harry Truman. But Truman's successor, Dwight Eisenhower, told darky jokes in the White House and lobbied Chief Justice Earl Warren to rule for the resistant white South in our landmark school desegregation case, Brown versus the Board of Education. The high point in presidential leadership on civil rights came during Southerner Lyndon Johnson's tenure. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, those are part of his legacy and they're part of ours. But their very passage marked the beginning of the dependence of the Republican Party on the politics of racial division to win elections and to gain power. And that in turn gave us Richard Nixon's Southern strategy. Now, tapes released just a week ago tell us a lot more about Richard Nixon. In 1973, when the Supreme Court handed down Roe versus Wade, he said nothing in public. But he can be heard on tape saying, "There are times when abortion is necessary." He said, "When you have a black and white," and he added, "or rape." Well, 35 years later, the nation elected the offspring of a black man and a white woman as the President of the United States. And it was fitting we've now arrived at the intersection of hope and change, and a black man is directing the traffic. It was fitting that Obama gave his acceptance speech as his party's nominee exactly 45 years to the day after Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington. For his inauguration, he rode to Washington on a railroad car built in the 1930s, when being a Pullman porter was the best job a black man could have and the worst job on the train. His swearing-in took place in front of the National Mall, which had been the site of a slave market. He took the oath standing on the steps of the Capitol, built by slaves who cut the timber, baked the bricks, and laid the stone for the foundation. He then moved into the White House, also built by slaves. And it's fitting he was sworn in almost exactly 100 years after the founding of the NAACP. Now, just as he launched his candidacy for the presidency in the shadow of Abraham Lincoln on the steps of the Illinois State Capitol in Springfield, so the NAACP issued a call to the nation on the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's birth in 1909. And that call asked then, as we ask now, for all believers in democracy to join in the renewal of struggle for political and civil liberty. The original incorporation papers of the NAACP listed as our goals to promote equality of rights, to eradicate caste or racial prejudice among the citizens of the United States, to advance the interest of its colored citizens, to secure for them impartial suffrage, and to increase their opportunities for securing justice in the courts, education for their children, and complete equality before the law. That was our mission then. That is our mission today. It's a special privilege for me to address you as chairman on the commemoration of our centennial. But this will be my last term as your chairman. I've decided not to offer for chair again. But unlike Sarah Palin, I'll serve out my current term. When Jay Leno left The Tonight Show, he noted that when he started, his hair was black and the president was white. Now, I can say, as I leave the chairmanship, that my hair is white and the president is black. And I can say that both of these things are attributable, at least in part, to the NAACP. Now, I want to make another announcement. The NAACP is going out of business. That is, the NAACP is going out of business when all of the nation's colored people have advanced to lives of promise and prosperity, not lives of peril and poverty. It turns out that President Taft was actually optimistic when he said we little brown brothers and sisters would need 50 to 100 years to gain equality with whites. Today, almost a quarter of black Americans nationwide live below the poverty line as compared to only 8.6% of whites. And almost every social indicator, from birth to death, reflects black-white disparities. Infant mortality rates are 146% higher for blacks. Chances of imprisonment are 447% higher. Rate of death from homicide 521% higher. Lack of health insurance 42% more likely. The proportion with a college degree 60% lower. And the average white American will live 5.5 years longer than the average black American. Now, when he made his New Orleans speech following Hurricane Katrina, President Bush spoke about the deep, persistent poverty which exists in our country. That poverty, he said, has its roots in a history of racial discrimination. The truth is that race trumps class. One scholar has written, concentrated poverty doesn't victimize poor whites the same way it does poor blacks. And Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of the NAACP, was the first social theorist to link class to race. He understood then what we must understand now. Race never stands apart from economic realities. The fragility of middle-class life for black Americans is illustrated by our downward mobility. Nearly half of all black people born into the middle class 40 years ago have descended into poverty or near poverty as adults, compared to only 16% of whites. As an example, home ownership rates for blacks, already low, are sinking under the weight of the subprime mortgage crisis, which stands likely to be the largest loss of African American wealth we have ever seen, wiping out a generation of home wealth building. Blacks are 3 times more likely to have subprime loans than whites, with such loans accounting for 55% of loans to blacks and only 17% of loans to whites. This didn't happen by accident. There's evidence that minority neighborhoods were actually targeted, that lenders have gone after people whom they think are less sophisticated borrowers. That's why the NAACP has filed 2 major lawsuits, alleging that lenders, including some of the largest in the nation, have engaged in systematic discrimination against racial minorities. This is a continuation of the work we've been doing now for a full century. For 100 years, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People has been the organization at the center of the struggle for racial justice in the United States. And today, as in the past, we are the organization African Americans look to when they need wrongs set right. In a remarkable new history of the NAACP called Lift Every Voice, historian Patricia Sullivan writes, Dr. Du Bois believed that the future of the NAACP, indeed its very survival, depended on securing a firm base among black Americans and organizing them around a common vision of political and social struggle. Polling data over decades shows how successful we've been in achieving Dr. Du Bois' vision. In poll after poll from the 1960s, when polling methodology and inclusiveness became reliable, until today, black Americans have overwhelmingly supported the NAACP and its work. In April 1963, for example, 60% of blacks viewed the NAACP favorably. Similarly, 92% rated the job done by the NAACP as positive in February 1965. That was then. Let me tell you about now. Today, the pattern goes on. 94% of blacks rate the NAACP as favorable or highly favorable. When others captured more headlines or more airtime, when new names rose or fell in fashion as fashion changed, the NAACP remained the constant. As Mary Wright Ovington, another NAACP founder, said at the time, we nailed our flag to the mast. From that time on, no one doubted where we stood. She described what made the NAACP great. She said the effort was continually made to induce the NAACP to sidestep the main issue, to unite with the conservatives, to relax a little in its uncompromising tone. But had it done this, she said, it would have slipped into oblivion. Its refusal to compromise brought it steadily increasing Negro support, and while it has never won over the great majority of the white friends of the Negro, it has held its original group together and each year has added a number of important, wholehearted white women and men. From its beginning, the NAACP has been an experiment in interracial alliance. Our founders were multiracial and multi-faith. Throughout the years, we've had many branches with white leadership and membership, with some with predominantly white members, including New York City from 1911 to 1915. Today, our membership and its leadership is diverse. We have 2,000 members in our main prison branch. Only 90 inmates there are black. In Seattle and San Jose, our branches have heavily Southeast Asian membership. In Alabama and Oklahoma, significant Latino membership. A Bangladeshi American was recently elected president of our Hamtramck, Michigan branch. We welcome all wholehearted women and men of whatever race, age, color, condition, or religion to join us. In the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, we know colored people come in all colors. As Ahmed Alamari, a Yemeni American who's a member of the NAACP, puts it, some people believe it's only for black people, but that's wrong. Everybody's colored people. Even white people are colored people. Now, we are an old organization, but we also appeal to young people. Over the last year and a half, we've chartered more than 35 new youth and college branches across the country. They range from the campuses of Harvard and Stanford universities to rural Jasper, Texas, and Piney Woods, Mississippi. Since the beginning of this year alone, we've welcomed 11 new youth units, including Utah Valley University, Long Island University C.W. Post Campus, Loyola University of Chicago, Cameron University, Phoenix Community College, the Greater Norristown Youth Council, the Vancouver Youth Council, the Tampa Youth Council, the Anchorage Youth Council, the Drake University College Chapter, and the Charlotte County Youth Council. We are the only civil rights organization that reserves 7 seats on our board of directors for young people under 25, elected only by young people under 25. Our young people know that this is and always has been their movement too. But just as our opponents deny our appeal to youth, they're also fond of talking about double standards. The real double standard is their refusal to acknowledge our struggle, while simultaneously claiming that the last success renders the struggle over. This past term, a group representing a utility district in Texas tried to get the United States Supreme Court to gut the jewel of the civil rights law, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The challengers opened their brief to the Supreme Court by declaring, "The America that has elected Barack Obama as its first African-American president is far different than when the Voting Rights Act was enacted in 1965. In other words, because Barack Obama won the presidency, we can now dismantle the civil rights protections and organizations that made it possible." Now, would they have made that same argument after World War II, that because the United States won the war, we could dismantle the military? The centrality of race in American history makes it impossible to overstate the significance of Obama's election as the 44th president of the United States. But that's also why his victory does not herald a post-civil rights America and does not mean that race as an issue has been vanquished. It will not end structural inequality or eliminate racist attitudes. Those who argue otherwise are engaged in sophistry of the highest order. We don't hear calls for elimination of the Anti-Defamation League because a Jewish woman sits on the Supreme Court or because a Jewish man is White House Chief of Staff. We don't hear calls for the elimination of the National Organization of Women because a woman is Speaker of the House and another Secretary of State. We don't hear calls for the elimination of the National Council of La Raza because a Latina is Secretary of Labor and another is poised to become a Justice of the United States Supreme Court. This focus on race is unique. Just as race is unique, excuse me, in American history. 100 years is a grand old age for an organization. It's only a fraction of a life in the lifetime of a nation. We're such a young nation, so recently removed from slavery, that only my father's generation stands between Julian bond and human bondage. Like many in this room, I'm the grandson of a slave. The Civil War was fought over whether white and black Americans shared a common humanity. Less than 10 years after it ended, the country chose sides with the losers and agreed to continue black subjugation for almost 100 years. And we're now being asked to believe that 200 years of being somebody's property, followed by 100 years of oppression in the South and discrimination in the North, that all this can be wiped away by 4 decades of half-hearted remediation and 1 presidential election. We're asked to believe that no permanent damage was done to the oppressors or the oppressed. We're asked to believe that we Americans are now a healed and whole people. That argument amounts to, at best, a big lie, and at worst, bigotry. Jim Crow may be dead, but racism is alive and well. It is the central fact of life for every non-white American, eclipsing income, position, and education. Race trumps them all. As the New York Times editorialized recently, it's easy to mock white supremacist views as pathetic and to assume that nativism in the age of Obama is going away. But racism has a nasty habit of never going away, no matter how much we want it to, and thus the perpetual need for vigilance. It only takes a cursory look at a worsening economic climate and a grim national mood to realize that history is always threatening to repeat itself. The perpetual need for vigilance is the reason why the Voting Rights Act exists. Those defending the act in court filed a brief showing how poorly Obama did among the states covered by the Voting Rights Act. While he received 47% of the white vote in largely northern states not covered by the Voting Rights Act, he got only 26% of the white vote in mainly Deep South states that are covered. According to this analysis, Obama actually did worse among whites than John Kerry in several of the covered jurisdictions, despite the nationwide Democratic swing. Is it that our opponents think we were so baracked in 2008 that we've forgotten we were bushed in 2000? We know that in the 2000 presidential elections, black voters, particularly in Florida, were dropped from the rolls in unprecedented numbers and showed up in polling places that had been moved without notice. We know that Georgia recently maintained an election verification system that was 60% more likely to adversely affect black voters than white voters. In short, structural disenfranchisement persists today as the modern equivalent of poll taxes, of grandfather clauses, of literacy tests, quietly invidious but equally destructive to the bedrock of our democracy. The Voting Rights Act, at least for now, survived the Supreme Court intact. The same can't be said, however, for Title VII, that part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that's supposed to protect against employment discrimination. 2 weeks ago, in a case involving a test for promotions in the New Haven, Connecticut Fire Department, the United States Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, set a new standard for Title VII enforcement and then didn't give New Haven a chance to meet it. This will ensure the department's senior ranks remain disproportionately white. This, as Justice Ginsburg noted in dissent, in a profession in which the legacy of racial discrimination cast an especially long shadow, and in a specific department which has increased its minority representation only through litigation-induced efforts. By undermining a standard that the court itself created almost 30 years ago, the 5-member majority needlessly muddled employment discrimination law and most assuredly weakened its enforcement. These 5 justices continue to refuse to recognize the difference between race as a restriction and race as a remedy. The best that can be said for this decision, called Ricky versus DiStefano, was that it could have been worse. In both Ricky and the voting rights case, the court stopped short of declaring the statutory provisions unconstitutional. The court, however, has changed the rules. It remains to be seen, however, whether or not President Obama will have a chance to change the court. Although Judge Sonia Sotomayor is the first nominee to the court by a Democratic president in 15 years, her expected confirmation will leave the court's current ideological split intact. Still, for Black Americans, much of the news today is good. That's a testament to our resilience and persistence and proof of the opportunity America can offer. If our progress remains incomplete, if too many of us have left the back of the bus for the front of the unemployment line, let us take heart. If there's much to be done, we now have much more to do it with, much more than those pioneers who brought us along this far. Never before have we been able to say that a Black man is running the country. Never before have we been able to say a Black woman is running Xerox. And never before have we been able to say that a Black man is the mayor of Philadelphia, Mississippi. Philadelphia, of course, is the place where in 1964, 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, were murdered. Not coincidentally, Philadelphia was where Ronald Reagan launched his first presidential campaign. 2 months ago, Philadelphia, still majority white, chose a Philadelphia native as its first Black mayor. None of these momentous changes would have occurred without the work of the modern movement for civil rights and the work that you and I and our predecessors have waged for the past 100 years. Obama's victory represented more than the victory of one man. An energized people said yes to justice, yes to equality, yes to peace. We now have a chance to redeem the promise of our government, to reclaim democracy for all, not for oil, to put mutual obligations over mutual funds and the public interest over private wealth. The success of Obama's campaign did more than elevate a community organizer. It elevated community organizing, and it gave new prestige to a time-honored calling that has served the downtrodden and unrepresented for centuries. Remember, Jesus of Nazareth was a community organizer. Remember, Pontius Pilate was a governor. The political right, reeling from their rejection, has tried to cast Obama's win as a center-right victory. That's centrally wrong. Just as the 2006 midterm election was a referendum on the war in Iraq and the war lost, the 2008 election was a referendum on free market fundamentalism and the free market lost. Those defeated in that election could not defend the indefensible: low or no taxes for the rich, minimal or no regulation for the market, and an economy that does not respect work. Yet the opposition party now is relying on opposition as their watchword and as their sole strategy. The lesson they seem to have taken from their defeat is they hadn't been extreme enough, and any pretense at moderation, never mind compassion, should be abandoned. But the world has changed, and it seems to be passing them by. With the regrettable exception of fights over marriage equality, the majority has also rejected a continuation of the cultural war as surely as they have rejected the war in Iraq. It isn't that the 1960s are over, it's that the 1960s have won. We know the stars aligned last November, so maybe Jupiter aligned with Mars. And maybe it's the dawning of a new age of Aquarius. Because the 1960s musical Hair, which I saw last night, won the Tony Award for Best Revival on Broadway. The New York Times reports that Hair is a main reason for the 60s comeback, along with the election of Barack Obama, whose appeals for hope and youthful followers brings to mind the idealism associated with the 1960s. The decade, the paper reports, evokes a time when young people were seeking to change society and trying to break free from a stale, tired way of life. The political naysayers are not only stale, they are pale. We now have the Palin party, even if Palin herself has paled. David Letterman said the 10 Republican primary candidates look ready to tee up at a restricted country club. Only one of the 10 Republican white men came to the 2007 NAACP convention, and it wasn't John McCain. By contrast, all 8 of the Democratic candidates chose to appear. But as long as they do not look like or appeal to minority voters, the naysayers will remain the minority party. And as long as they trade in yesterday's outmoded rhetoric, condemning their opponents as socialist and dividing us into the real and presumably the fake Americans, they deserve to be a minority party. And the rest of us, blacks, Latinos, Asians, gays, lesbians, young people, women, who now form the backbone of an emerging progressive majority, we must now be heard and we must be heeded. And how we respond now and how we are responded to will determine whether the Obama presidency is bolstered or burdened by high expectations. There needs to be a constantly growing and always reviving movement across America if we are to maintain and expand the victories won on November 4th. The ascent of new faces in high places may prove entirely ephemeral if the change they promise isn't constantly reinforced by independent outside agitation, ensuring that temporary change becomes permanent and the basis for more aggressive and more progressive change in the future. When the NAACP wages the battle against inequity, we expand democracy for everyone. When we successfully fought to end lynch mobs against African Americans, we also ended mob violence against Italians and Catholics, other groups who were targeted for lynching in the South. When we fought for political inclusion, it paved a way for the inclusion of gays, of women, the elderly, practitioners of practitioners of all religions, members of ethnic groups, and individuals with disability. At the local level, the NAACP is the triage center for communities in crisis. Whether it's helping unionize 5,000 workers at the world's largest pork processing plant in North Carolina last December, or whether it's helping organize workers in Alabama in the only factory authorized to make baseball caps for the major leagues, or whether it's offering Muslim prisoners in Oregon the right to wear Muslim clothing and have their religion respected, or whether it's registering hundreds of mostly white prisoners to vote in Maine, or whether it's fighting school closings in low-income neighborhoods in Seattle, or suing the Department of Housing and Urban Development for allowing the governor of Mississippi to divert money designated for Katrina victims, or whether it's last week's announcement that the ACC announced they would honor the NAACP's boycott of South Carolina until the Confederate swastika comes down from the state capitol. Wherever it is, whenever it is, the NAACP is here now as it's been for a century. It's been for a century redressing the injustices that right the wrongs. Our victories sometimes took decades and were often dismissed as impossible and illusory by our critics. The NAACP launched the modern movement for civil rights with our Supreme Court victory in Brown v. Board in 1954. Brown effectively ended segregation's legality, and it gave a nonviolent army the license to challenge segregation's morality as well. A year after Brown, an NAACP activist in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat on a city bus so a white man could sit down. 5 years after Montgomery, 4 young black men, college students in Greensboro, refused to give up their seats at a dime store lunch counter reserved for whites. These small acts of passive resistance to American apartheid and the cumulative acts of tens of thousands more helped create a people's movement that eliminated legal segregation in less than a decade. These people walked in dignity rather than ride in shame. They faced bombs in Birmingham and mobs in Mississippi. They sat down at lunch counters so others could stand up. They marched and they organized. They proved that ordinary women and men can accomplish extraordinary things. The successful strategies of the modern movement were litigation, organization, mobilization, and coalition, all of them aimed at creating a national constituency for civil rights. Sometimes it's the simplest of acts, sitting down at a lunch counter, going to a new school, applying for a marriage license, casting a vote. Sometimes these can challenge the way we think and the way we act. We have a long and honorable tradition of social justice in this country. It still sends forth the message, as does Obama's victory, that when we act together, we can overcome. This former community organizer ran the most organized campaign in history. It led to a victory that was not only broad but deep, especially with respect to 18 and 29-year-olds, 66% of whom voted for Obama. He carried every age group except those over 65. He won a higher percentage of white men than any Democrat since Jimmy Carter. He won among women by a margin of 56 to 43%. He won among 96% of blacks, 67% of Hispanics, and 92% of Asians. He carried 8 of the 10 largest states and 9 states that went for George Bush in 2004. In that election, 3 former Confederate states rejoined the Union. And as a result, our country rejoined the world community. Before November 4th, we were a pariah state. In the aftermath, we've begun to reclaim some of the esteem in which America once was held. We ought to take time to celebrate our new president, and we have to give him time to succeed. The poet Langston Hughes wrote, "Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." Now that President Obama has taken the oath, America will be. It will be America for and to all of us, and it will be up to all of us to ensure that America lives up to its incredible promise. The NAACP is up to that task, as we have been for all of our 100 years. Oswald Garrison Villard, grandson of the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison and the NAACP founder who wrote the call, predicted during the planning of the NAACP, it all ought to be the beginning of something big. And it was. The beginning of the biggest, baddest, boldest civil rights organization in the history of the world. We are here. We are here to stay as long as we are needed. Here's to our next century. Thank you.